This is episode 29 of On the DOT, your go-to source for information about the Indiana Department of Transportation. Every month we take you on a deep dive into the inner workings of the agency to answer your burning questions about roads, bridges, and everything in between. On this month's episode, we're talking INDOT's efforts to upgrade infrastructure for electric vehicles. We join HNTB's Diane Newton to talk about the planning process, what to expect, and how you can get involved. Thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoyed this month's edition of On the DOT. Welcome to On the DOT. I'm Jason Tiller, Communications Director for INDOT Southwest, and I'm actually joined today by a very special guest, someone who you may be hearing from in the future, Gary Bryan. He's our new Public Relations Director in the Vincennes District, and we have the very distinct pleasure of talking to Diane Newton, who is the National Practice Consultant with HNTB, and we're going to talk today about a pretty significant initiative within the state of Indiana, right, Diane?
That's right.
Yeah. So let's just, first and foremost, we'll jump right in. Talk to us, give a 10,000-foot overview of what we're going to talk about on this podcast today and what Indiana is doing.
Sure. So the 2021 Bipartisan Infrastructure Law created a national electric vehicle infrastructure program. And in that program, there is both formula and discretionary money available to states to help build out our electric vehicle charging infrastructure. The national goal is to create a network of 500,000 EV chargers by 2030. And the immediate near-term goal for each state is to create a state implementation plan to demonstrate and plan for their contributions to those 500,000 chargers.
And that makes total sense, because think about it like this. When the gas engine first came out, when it was brand new technology, I'm sure you didn't have a gas station on every corner. And so I'm sure there was some kind of planning that had to go into building gas stations so that you could fuel up the car. And this is kind of similar, right? That's
correct. So the goal, the end date of the goal I mentioned is 2030, but the NEVI funds are available for the next 5 years, the formula funding, and there'll also be a competitive grant program for local communities, transit agencies, things like that. So it is sort of that first step to improve the ability for EVs to travel long distances and reduce what they call range anxiety, which is a concern that you're going to find yourself stranded without a charging station to hook up to.
Yeah, you said that earlier when we were discussing pre-interview, and I said, I'll let you know when I want you to discuss something further, and you just did it perfectly right there. Range anxiety, that's a term that most people don't hear. Mm-hmm. They don't, unless you drive an electric car. Maybe you don't necessarily have that. I mean, let's be honest, you don't experience that if you're driving a gas-powered car because there's a gas station everywhere you go.
Correct.
So, I mean, is range anxiety, is that something that I imagine in Indiana it's probably a little more so, more prominent than it would be in larger areas like California, where they've had this for a little bit longer, or at least adopted it earlier.
Correct. Yes, the formula is based on the amount of money that each state is receiving is based on your current infrastructure and how much is available. And it is directed to what they call alternative fuel corridors, so that ensures that the money stays along these well-traveled routes. In Indiana, our alternative fuel corridors are all the interstates, plus the loop routes around Fort Wayne, so 469 and 265 around Louisville. So the priority for INDOT is to leverage that investment along the alternative fuel corridors. And Indiana, I don't think I mentioned it, but Indiana is going to receive just under $100 million for those 5 years in formula funding through the program.
So if we're getting $100 million, does that mean that we've got less infrastructure than most places?
It just depends. It does depend on the size of the state, the amount of infrastructure that you have, the amount of traveling. They do a lot of analysis of EV adoption and where that stands. So it is a pretty complicated formula, but some states receive more. The bigger states receive more. Obviously, like even Texas and California being more populated states, still are receiving a lot of money just because of their geographic size.
And that makes total sense. I mean, it's kind of the argument of Vincennes receiving, state funding versus Indianapolis. Well, Indianapolis has a whole lot more people. So that makes total sense. Okay, so talk to me about the funding specifically. Now, I know it's government funded, and you mentioned an acronym earlier. Can you get what is the acronym's name, and kind of what is the source of that funding? Source may not be the right word, but kind of unpack how that program came to be, I guess.
The NEVI program?
Yes.
So it is National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, and it is being administered through a newly stood up joint federal office, which is the joint U.S. Department of Transportation and U.S. Department of Energy. And it was it's its own line item in the bipartisan infrastructure law. So it was allocated and created as part of that law that passed in November of 2021.
And yeah, so that makes total sense to me, because we've known for a long time that this type of infrastructure is going to be needed. I mean, Purdue has done studies about this as well. If you go back and listen to our episode with Darcy Bullock, he actually talked about Indiana's need for this type of infrastructure. So, we've known this is coming for quite a while. And then, the president just this year has announced that by a certain time, all vehicles will need to be electric, all newly manufactured vehicles, that is. And so, it's not something, from my perspective, it sounds like this is a wonderful step forward for the state of Indiana.
It is, and it's a good opportunity to create the infrastructure in areas that are publicly accessible, ensures access in disadvantaged communities and rural communities. So the good thing about it being a federally funded program are those requirements that ensure the infrastructure will be located every 50 miles and within 1 mile of an interstate, and there's extra requirements around having infrastructure located in disadvantaged communities, rural areas. There's all these sort of elements of the NEVI guidance that was provided to the states and is being updated. The initial guidance was provided in February of this year, February of 2022. More guidance is expected in the next couple weeks that provide even more specifications around what the station should look like, what the requirements are, and how that all flows down to eventual procurement with private entities for the construction, installation, operations, and maintenance of the station.
That's a lot to unpack, just to be quite honest with you. That's a lot to go on. So we've talked about quite a bit of different, there's a lot to digest there, just to be quite honest with you. And so what I want to do is I want to give the listeners a minute to take all of what we just talked about in for a second, maybe even go back and listen, give them a shorter segment so that they can, it's a little easier to digest for them. And then when we come back, I want to talk a little bit more about the process and what INDOT's goals are, and where we have to be, what milestones we have to hit, and ultimately, what that process has looked like with all of our people and all of the people that are involved in that process. So we'll be right back with more on the DOT.
Before 1989, INDOT was known as the Indiana Department of Highways, but highways became transportation, and our logo tells the story why. Only one of the four icons, the car, represents Indiana roadways. The airplane, the train, and the bus represent some of the other modes of transportation that our multimodal division helps manage. Along with the Federal Highway Administration, INDOT works with federal agencies for rail, aviation, freight, and transit. To learn more, visit us online at multimodal.indot.in.gov. INDOT, we're more than just Hoosier roads.
There's never been a better time to start your career with INDOT. Entry-level positions now start at $19 an hour, and with a CDL you can earn even more. Go to INDOTjobs.com or text INDOT Careers to 468-311 to apply now.
In 2019, distracted driving was a factor in nearly 2,000 injury crashes in Indiana, killing more than 20 people. To make Hoosier roads safer, hands-free while driving is now the law. That means you can't have a mobile device in your hand while driving. You can still use a phone or tablet in your car, but you must use a speakerphone, headset, Bluetooth, or other hands-free technology. Go hands-free. Learn about the new law at handsfreeindiana.com.
And welcome back to On the DOT. I'm here with Diane Newton. And Gary, you haven't joined us just yet.
Yeah, I know.
You've been a little quiet over there. But
I'm kind of like the listener. I'm just taking it all in, kind of learning as well.
And Gary, for the record, he is on his third day at INDOT while we are recording this.
That's correct.
And, honestly, Gary, it's a pleasure to have you on. For those who don't know, he has worked in the news media and in the local area in Vincennes and Terre Haute surrounding areas. So we're glad to have him on. He's going to be doing some stuff with us and potentially, again, guest hosting this podcast at some point. Definitely. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself real quick.
Well, originally from Terre Haute, and I've been down, I was reporting in Vincennes area for about 4 years for station based out of Terre Haute. So big journalism person, and kind of tying into this, and maybe this will be a way to bring it back, is, I've done a lot of work reporting on stories with Crane and the folks at Westgate and Purdue, and they're doing a lot of stuff with whether that's semiconductors or electric vehicles, and it just blows my mind where everything is these days, and to see how much and this open field in the middle of central Indiana is building up what will probably be, the front of everything. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, even INDOT itself, I know there's some plans for us to get some electric vehicles as part of our fleet at some point. So what we're talking about today is very, very relevant to, even to us here at INDOT. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about the process. And Diane, what questions would you ask, I guess, is my first question. What do people need to know about this process and where we are at currently in it and where we've been so far?
Right, it is a big process, and I think something that you mentioned that I do want to clarify, that the formula funding is to build out passenger EV charging. There will be the competitive grant program, the discretionary grant program will include provisions, and there will be eligible expenses for like fleet electrification, as you mentioned, school bus electrification, public transit, freight, those kind of things. So this formula NEVI funding is focused on passenger electric vehicle charging infrastructure. And the thing about formula funding is that it does require the states to submit a plan for what the next 5 years look like. How do they want to approach the build out of the charging infrastructure? What do they need to do? What do they have existing? What do they need to build out? So the plans are due to the joint federal office on August 1st, and then they have until September 30th to review and approve the plan. That is needed for the funds to be obligated to the state agency. So that's kind of the critical, immediate, near-term step, is to create this plan. And the plan contains a lot of different elements. There's 14 sections required in the federal guidance to include in this plan. It includes everything from, what is INDOT's vision and goals? How did we engage the public in this process? It's a critical element to make sure we are listening to the public when we're developing this plan and meeting their needs. But then we also have to talk about, what does contracting and procurement look like? And a big part of it is actually doing sort of this literature review of a lot of the great research and studies that Purdue has done. Those are two big major sources for us. Both the work of Dr. Bullock and Dr. Griska, they've done analysis of EV adoption and EV travel patterns, and as well as a lot of stakeholder engagement with the different stakeholders who are involved in EV charging, like original equipment manufacturers, utility companies, private companies. So there are some very, very well-rounded, thorough studies that we can draw upon to create this understanding of what is the existing condition of EV charging in Indiana. And then a second big piece of that is sort of mapping these gaps, understanding along those alternative fuel corridors in Indiana, which are the interstates, where is the charging infrastructure and where are the gaps. That will help us to prioritize, like if we have to have charging infrastructure every 50 miles and within 1 mile of an interstate, there's going to be some pretty clear gaps. And so we can present a lot of that mapping and understanding of our current environment. So a big focus of the plan is the mapping. And then also just making sure we're checking the box, we're meeting the needs and understanding the civil rights implications, the equity implications, cybersecurity, and data collection, so we can evaluate how effective the program has been and did we meet the goals we set out to achieve.
And that's, I want you to unpack the last little bit of that a little bit, because a lot of people don't understand, electric vehicles, it just means we got to find a way to charge them. They don't necessarily realize, hey, there's got to be some cybersecurity involved in this. There's got to be some equity, some social justice type stuff. And it's not necessarily for any political reason. It's just we want to make sure that we're serving every single community. So talk a little bit about those things. I mean, you can do that individually or as a group, however you want to do that. But I want to make sure that we highlight, this unique thing that goes into a project that you wouldn't necessarily expect.
Right. It is sort of like when you mentioned building out the gas station network, that is very much the point that we're at with respect to EV charging infrastructure. So there are lofty goals by the Biden administration to encourage EV adoption, but part of that is making EVs more affordable. I think a lot of the automakers are committed to doing that. So the infrastructure has to be ready to support every level of EV adoption. So, people, I think, understand Teslas, but they don't understand that Tesla has a proprietary charging model. So there's not a universal plug-in for a Tesla. You have a special plug-in, and that a Tesla charger is not going to meet the needs of a majority of current and future EV drivers. So we have to be ready, and that's kind of part of the equity considerations, is that EVs are not only affordable, but the infrastructure is in the areas where those potential drivers are living. They can are available at like multi-unit dwellings, and that the payment, so that's the other element of charging infrastructure, is that just like gas, you have to pay for it, but that means we have to make payment options that support the potential unbanked user who may not have a credit card, and we have to protect their personal information much like a credit card would. So there's certain things that are, you just have to make sure you plan for and have accounted for in the plan.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there are a couple things within that I think we can all take away from that. One, charging is not necessarily going to be free. I don't think that really dawns on a lot of people. Like, I think a lot of people buy an electric vehicle thinking, oh, well, I can just charge it and it's free. But I mean, even if you're charging it at your house, you're using like what, $1.50 a day or something like that to charge your vehicle, something like that?
Correct.
So that money has to come from somewhere. So it's going to be cheaper than gas, I'm assuming.
Yes.
Or at least I'm sure that's the goal.
The charging structures may vary. I mean, there's going to be times of peak demand. I mean, I think it's sort of a combination of gas usage versus electricity, and how, you pay more for certain utilities at certain times of the year and based on the demand. So the grid is demand responsive. And so if there's high periods of demand, we may have to charge more during those periods. So these charging models are very much, there's many different options, and we don't necessarily think that's INDOT's role to define what the charging model should be, but we understand that it will probably vary. It will probably vary across the state and depending on the community that you're in. So I mentioned the public engagement. One thing that we're doing is now we had a virtual open house, but we're also having in-person meetings in all 3 areas of the state. So we're going to have a meeting in northern Indiana, central Indiana, and southern Indiana, so that we can kind of have those public conversations and get their feedback and understand some of these challenges.
So right now, looking at the data that you have, either from Purdue or what you've gathered on your own, what are some of the areas of Indiana that we think that will probably be the focus as far as where we begin? I know that Indianapolis already has some of this, but there's not so much of it, say, in, Dale, Indiana, which is, down south near the Ohio River.
Right.
So I know we're probably not to the point where we have got a plan for rollout yet, but on the same token, I'm sure it's been discussed where the areas of need are, correct?
Correct. We are assessing where those gaps are. Resolving those 50-mile gaps is obviously the highest priority.
Why is it a 50-mile gap? I'm sorry, I don't
50
mean to
miles
interrupt.
is in the federal NEVI guidance. So
Okay.
there's there's multiple requirements, but I would say the top most important ones to remember is that to be compliant with NEVI funding is you have to be resolving that 50-mile gap. The infrastructure has to be within 1 mile of an alternative fuel corridor, and you have to deploy 4 150 kilowatt chargers. So there have to be 4 spaces that provide 150 kilowatt chargers available. So that is a little bit of an upgrade. That's a DC fast charger versus like a level 2, which is a lower level of power, takes longer to charge. So it is sort of creating that consistency in not only the location of the charging infrastructure, but the power and capacity at the charging stations. So within Indiana, like resolving those 50-mile gaps, that's a given. That's of the highest priority. But we also want to make sure we meet the needs of the high demand areas. So that may mean going above and beyond those minimum requirements. That's another high priority. And then the second 2 other priorities is obviously prioritizing disadvantaged communities and rural areas, which in Indiana there are going to be larger pockets of rural areas. And then finally, another kind of criteria or priority is the utility readiness of the infrastructure. That just basically affects the timeline. So we may be able to get infrastructure out faster in the areas where there is 3-phase utility power available versus areas that we may need to do more on the utility coordination, utility build out in order to prepare for the charging infrastructure installation. So those are sort of our high level, 4 or 5 high level criteria, I guess, for building out the infrastructure.
Well, and that was getting ready to be my next question, because as you were talking about, the high demand versus the resolving the 50-mile, what did you call it?
The 50-mile gaps.
The gaps.
Mm-hmm.
So resolving the gaps versus the high demand, I mean, you would think that that'd be a simple solution, to the layman's person. They're going to sit here and think, well, if you don't have any infrastructure in an area, then obviously you want to hit that area first. But that's not necessarily the case, because you may have more work to do in those rural areas. I go back again to Spencer County, Indiana, which is, again, down by the Ohio River, very, very rural. You're probably going to have to run some electrical out to the charging stations. So you're actually going to have to build infrastructure, whereas say in somewhere like Bloomington, you're probably going to have that more readily available.
Correct.
Okay.
Right. And that's why we'll identify the gaps, but filling the gaps is we're going to be more loosely defined in terms of how the gap is filled, because there may be an ideal location, but that location may not have utilities. You may have to extend utilities by a mile or more, and that may be cost prohibitive. So it may make more sense to actually install 2 stations around that single primary location, because there may be utilities that are accessible and more ready for the infrastructure. So we know we've done enough mapping to know that we need a minimum probably of 40 or so stations, but that number obviously would fluctuate based on where can you install it, where is the infrastructure ready. And so we've kind of understood that there's this point where you could flex up to probably 70 stations. So we have this range of we're forecasting 40 to 70 new charging stations.
You mentioned, in areas that may be a little more difficult or it may be cost prohibitive to pull utilities, more than a mile. I mean, that ends up being a better benefit to the consumer. I mean, you say the number can fluctuate between 40 and 70. I mean, if we stuck to one specific number, that's pretty rigid. But with this, it seems like the consumer might be able to have more bang for their buck, or at the very least have more convenience along those corridors, especially in areas where it was cost prohibitive for us to bring utilities to one location. So now we're building 2 in 2 different locations. So they're going to have more options.
Correct. Yeah, and they may be able to leverage amenities, existing site hosts. There may be, this opportunity to make more partnerships. Indiana DOT is really excited about partnering with the private sector to do the construction and installation of the charging infrastructure. So does create more opportunity.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of interesting things that can happen. You say opportunity, and I said exactly the same thing, just differently. But it's definitely something that you can think about, because there's probably going to be, think about the business we're going to attract. Think about the infrastructure for, truck drivers, things of that nature. I mean, we're going to be able to add probably parking. We're probably going to be able to add convenience stores. I mean, there's a lot of, again, opportunity, but there's opportunity for more than just upgrading our infrastructure at this point. I mean, we're talking about major life-changing or making life better for a lot of people who are on the roadways, even just because we're adding charging stations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of amenities that you could work into these charging stations. It's very much like we're trying to amenities. Yeah, we're trying. You got to think outside the box. But again, this is a good opportunity for INDOT to partner with the private sector and hear what their ideas are. So there's, I would say, a major focus of our effort, besides reviewing the existing research, is to just we're having as many one-on-one meetings as we can with charging providers and utility companies and public citizens. So we're doing a big focus of our effort, especially in May and June, is having all of these conversations, hearing what people have to say, and we're going to work all of that into the plan. We got 2 surveys live. We have a public survey and a utility company survey questionnaire. We've had the virtual event that I mentioned, the virtual open house that was on May 11th, and then the 3 in-person meetings. So a lot of this is just hearing what people's priorities are, not only people, but utility companies and charging providers. And, you'd be surprised at the number of stakeholders that are interested in this topic.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to dive deeper into, the public involvement piece of this. But first, I want to take a break, and we'll come back and we'll talk a little bit about the virtual hearings and how those have gone, the surveys, and how people can get involved in the public involvement piece of all this. So we'll be right back with more on the DOT.
Somebody needs to report that pothole.
Why aren't they mowing the grass in the median?
When are they going to fix this road?
There's an easy way to get answers to those questions and report the problems you see on interstates, U.S. routes, and state roads. Dial 1-855-INDOT-4U to talk to a live customer service professional. That's 855-463-6848. Hate talking on the phone or have a fear of human interaction? We've got you covered. Go online to INDOT4U.com to use our Report a Concern tool. You can also report a concern through our INDOT mobile app for iPhone and Android. If you've got questions, we've got answers at 855-INDOT-4U or online at INDOT4U.com.
At the Indiana Department of Transportation, it's not all work and no play. INDOT offers employees unmatched work-life balance, competitive benefits, and perks like a 37.5-hour work week, paid holidays, paid time off, career paths, and tuition reimbursement. Entry-level positions start at $19 per hour. CDL drivers can earn even more, so stop grinding and start thriving. Go to INDOTjobs.com or text INDOT Careers to 468-311 to apply now.
This is Sergeant Todd Ringel with Indiana State Police. According to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, distracted driving claims thousands of lives every year. Many drivers use their cell phones while driving. That creates an enormous potential for fatalities and injuries on our roadways. Distracted driving is any activity that diverts your attention from driving, including talking or texting on your phone. You cannot drive safely unless the task of driving has your full attention. You can help us reduce crashes by putting down your cell phone, avoiding all other distractions, and just drive.
Welcome back to our final segment of On the DOT. Diane Newton with HNTB and Gary Bryan. Gary, you gotta
Hey, I'm just taking it in. So
it's Bob and Tom right now.
Yeah, right. Well, and the thing I kind of wanted to get into too, not to take your lead here, but if I'm listening to this at home, I'm somebody. So how can I start getting my voice heard? How can I start getting input on this?
Well, INDOT is really committed to the public engagement piece of developing our implementation plan. We've had one virtual open house. We had it on May 11th, but we have 3 in-person meetings coming up in June. We'll be in Northern Indiana on June 2nd, in Central Indiana on June 9th, and in Southern Indiana on June 14th. And those will be public meetings where we present, as much as we know, kind of the current status of the plan development and just kind of hear what questions people have and what comments they have. And we'll take as much of that input as we get and fold it into the plan, which we will then be finalizing by the end of June, so we can do a good review with INDOT and their partner agencies. They are chairing a working group of 4 other agencies. So we want to make sure we do an in-depth review with INDOT and their partners and finalize the plan in time to submit before the August 1st deadline.
Very good. So talk a little bit about what we're hearing already. I know you mentioned that we'd had 12,000 responses to what we've already done at
1,200. Okay, you're freaking me out. 12,000 would be a lot.
Yeah.
Maybe we launched our public survey online on Friday, May 13th. Okay. And as of Monday, so in just a couple of days, we got 1,200 responses. So and it's going to be open until June 8th. So by June 8th, we actually may have 12,000 responses.
Yeah, and that's to put it in perspective. I mean, this is something, there's a lot of interest in this particular project, and we may put out a survey or something like that, and maybe for 2-week period get like 60 to 80 to 100 responses. I mean, it's just that's Vincennes district, that's southwestern Indiana. A lot of people aren't necessarily connected down there anyway, but on the same token, we're talking responses from all over the state right now, 1,200 of them in just 3 days.
Mm-hmm.
So
that's right.
I mean, so that's massive response as far as what we normally see. So talk a little bit about what you're hearing as far as a part of this. I mean, are we talking like customers who are for or against it? We talking business owners who are trying to get in on it? Like what are we hearing? Is it a mixed bag of all of that?
It's definitely a mix. I mean, we've seen a lot of individuals that are just curious about the timing of things and when infrastructure will be available to them. It ranges to the charging providers who are interested, making it very well known that they're ready to respond to an RFP. They have a business that meets the needs of the program and they want to contribute. To utility companies who are wanting to make sure that their infrastructure is ready to support the charging infrastructure. So I will say in general, everyone has been very positive. It's just generally a high level of interest from all types of stakeholders. And some of it are very much have the business solution to meet the needs, but also there's sort of these supporting site hosts that, hey, I want an EV charging station at my gas station because I want to be able to meet the needs of my customers. I feel like this could attract a new kind of customer. So it is a mixed bag of stakeholder type, but everyone, I would say, is overwhelmingly interested in the timing and how they can help and how they can contribute.
Wonderful. So August 1st is when our preliminary draft, right, has to be turned in?
The draft, no, the final draft. You
Final
can submit.
draft,
You can
okay.
submit it early, and they will provide comments, and you have an opportunity to update before August 1st. So that's why we're shooting to submit a little bit early.
Okay, perfect. But that drop dead date is August 1st. So what happens between now and then?
So between now and then, we are focused on leveraging that existing research from Purdue, doing a lot of the mapping, while simultaneously pursuing a lot of the public involvement and public engagement, having as many conversations as we can. Those are the two major pieces of the puzzle that we're going to come together and create our plan, our draft plan. The plan will sort of map that existing research to those 14 sections that I mentioned. We know there'll be some gaps. We hope we can fill the gaps with what we've heard through the public engagement process. And then we'll workshop with INDOT to finalize the plan content and make sure it says what they wanted to say, that we're satisfying their goals. We're talking articulately about the vision for EV infrastructure in Indiana and how we measure progress going forward. So that's the interim short-term focus is on developing that implementation plan.
And it makes total sense that we would want to get that in early and get the comments from the federal government, because I imagine those would be invaluable.
Yes, very much. And we're trying to collect, the other reason to do the in-person meetings is to get public comment sort of in advance on the parts and pieces as they're coming into, as we're developing them.
So ultimately, we're taking extra steps to kind of make sure we're doing right by everyone involved, including the public and the federal government.
Correct. And we haven't finalized the approach yet, but we do expect that we would publish the August 1st version publicly, so that the plan will be a living document that will be updated regularly going forward. So it's not just something that we're going to write and it's going to, be archived. It's going to live on, it's going to live and grow, and we're going to add detail to it as the program moves forward after August 1st.
And where we'll be able to find that?
It'll be on INDOT's webpage.
All right. So after August 1st, on or after, as I like to say in my press releases, we're going to have that up on INDOT's website, so be sure to check that out. So I'm going to ask you to speculate just a little bit here, and we are running up on our time limit, so I want to try to fit this in. What happens after August 1st? I know that we're looking at into the future for this project, so we've got to start everything now. I mean, it takes 3 to 5 years to plan a project, is what I always like to say. So what are our next steps following that August 1st deadline?
So after August 1st, basically the work continues. I mean, the plan is just that, it's a plan, but you may not have fleshed out your approach to each and every element of that plan. So what INDOT really wants to do is to continue to build that out, fill in gaps after August 1st, ultimately leading towards a procurement process for EV charging infrastructure. They recognize, but they want to make sure that the RFP is thorough, that it reflects their needs of their partners, and is flexible and accommodates private industry, because we recognize the contributions and the value of the private sector in this space. So we do expect that RFP procurement would be not in 2022, but perhaps 2023. And then, normal INDOT procurement, we're going to be in 6 to 9 month time frame, and we're trying to account and balance and be conservative about estimating timeframes because of supply chain delays and things like that. So we expect to do some type of RFP in 2023, award and construction starting in 2024 with charging infrastructure. All of that, a ribbon cutting, if you will, would be dependent on supply chain delays and how fast things can move. But there's no expiration date on the funding. So it's all going to be allocated within the 5 years, but from that point, in terms of expending the funds, it's dependent on how long the project takes, and there's no expiration date for the funding.
That's awesome. So just to kind of summarize what you just said, it's not out of the question to think we may have brand new electric vehicle infrastructure with gaps addressed and new and better infrastructure within the state of Indiana, really bringing us into more of a modern attraction for workplaces and things like that by 2025.
That's right. Yeah, in the next 2 to 3 years, I would say.
That's awesome. Diane, thank you so much for being on with us today. This has been a blast, and I hope that I hope that the public has learned something about this. Gary, I hope you've learned something here on your third day.
I hope I didn't talk too much.
No. No, this has been great. So, Diane, where can people find current documents if they want to get involved in the survey, if they want to get involved in the public involvement piece of it? Where can they find that right now?
All that will be on INDOT's webpage. So our webinar recording of the virtual open house will be up there. Our online surveys are up there, and we'll published the RFI results. INDOT published an RFI in April, and the results are being summarized right now. So once we have a good summary of that, hopefully later this month, that will be online as well.
All right, perfect. So be checking back to indot.in.gov for those, and then we'll also be sharing those out on our social media pages. You can find all of those via the central office page, following them on Twitter at INDOT or at INDOT on Facebook. So, Diane, thank you so much for being with us today. This has been On the DOT, a production of the Indiana Department of Transportation. For more information, please visit our website at indot.in.gov. For the latest updates on road conditions or construction, you can download our INDOT mobile app for Apple and Android devices. Submit your roadway concerns by calling 1-855-INDOT-FOR-YOU or online at indot4u.com. Find all of that information in the description of this episode. Full episodes of On the DOT are available on YouTube by searching for INDOT. You can also follow INDOT and all 6 of our districts on Facebook and Twitter. If you like what you're hearing, please be sure to leave us a rating on your favorite podcast platform. Join us again every third Thursday for new episodes of On the DOT. Until then, travel safely, and thank you for joining us on the DOT.